So for long, climate policy has focused on climate change mitigation, so how we reduce greenhouse gases emissions. And this is obviously the first thing that needs to be done, but at the same time, there is an increasing recognition that climate change is here, at least some degrees of climate change, and that therefore there needs to be thinking about what it means for reducing the vulnerability of societies, of economies, of territories to the effects of climate change. So this is climate change adaptation. And so far, climate change adaptation has been taken up by some governments, some international organizations, some business companies, but very little has been done in terms of trade unions thinking about what climate change adaptation means. One example that could be given is in the construction sector. With climate change, you are expecting an increase in bad weather, in more warmer days during the summer, longer periods of heat waves in the cities. Also in the winter, you expect more bad weather. Days during which workers cannot work. It's dangerous for them to do so. So what happens to them when they cannot work? Who is compensating their wages for the working days lost? So one trade union in Switzerland, UNIA, has negotiated a mechanism for compensating lost days of work because of bad weather. So this is an example that could be taken up and incorporated into thinking, well, what will climate change mean in terms of working conditions? Other examples are obviously related to local public services, where you can expect, because of climate change, more floods. Again, it depends on the regions, but then the vulnerability of the specific regions and territories will depend very much on the level of response that can be put together by fire brigades, for instance. So again, here the development of public services is strongly related to the impacts that climate change will have, and whether these impacts will be catastrophic or not depends on the level of responses that societies, territories can provide. So I think this is a major challenge in terms of climate change. Yeah, actually it's a very old argument. It was made in the 1980s saying, well, what climate change brings is an increasing uncertainty about the future. So it means we cannot plan. You cannot organize for the future because of climate changes. Well, all your plans will, fail. And therefore, the only institution that is actually able to adapt and thrive constantly under the conditions of climate change are market mechanisms, because market is supposed to be flexible and so on and so forth. And so that was an argument that has been put forward and that has been used in order to say, well, because of climate change, we need to increase market penetrations. So for instance, insurance companies are now selling micro-insurance policies in southern countries against the effects of bad weather. And these sorts of arguments are taken for granted, but in fact, when you examine them, they're not that convincing. And in fact, you can put exactly the opposite argument that's saying, well, precisely because of climate change, precisely because of the increasing uncertainties, you need more planning, you need more collective capacities to foresee the future and also to organize to make sure that whatever happens, there are solutions that are in place. And which entities are actually able to do this sort of forward thinking is basically states. It's basically collective organizations in which, for instance, you can organize food provisions in terms of overcoming the effect of an increased period of drought, for instance. The same is true about electricity production, electricity generation. Which entity has the ability to invest and to get return over 40, 50 years, which is basically what you have in hydropower, for instance. So actually, these sorts of arguments about the increasing uncertainty can be transformed and can be put forward as, well, we need to create more certainties, we need to create more planning, and we need to create more collective organizations. And this is where trade unions, progressive NGOs, progressive social movements, and progressive local states, and I think the role of of cities, of municipalities, so the local level, is extremely important, because cities in a lot of countries actually have the power to organize electricity generation, distribution, have the power to organize water distribution. And this is where also local social forces can concentrate and can bring about actual changes. So in terms of climate change adaptation, I think one of the focus needs to be on how do we organize progressive movements, trade unions, environmental NGOs, and try to pressure at the local level so that these questions are taken into account.